It seems like it's getting more violent, and it seems like right now the opposition is not tiring.
It is getting more violent. It's also getting more political in the sense of it's not just about democracy, it's about regime change and increasingly saying to the Russians, keep your hands off Belarus.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Backstory. Coming to you from London, I'm Dana Lewis. Belarus, 10 million people, an election in August that was clearly a fraud. Every weekend, hundreds of thousands take to the streets demanding the ex-president Lukashenko step down. He's not recognized as a president by European countries because the election in Belarus was a sham, wasn't it, Mr. Lukashenko? It's not the first time we've spoken about Belarus here. The situation is escalating now. The opposition leader who was forced to flee Belarus has given Lukashenko an ultimatum. Step aside, or she will call everyone to strike and bring the entire country to a halt in late October. Her name is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She only ran because her husband, who was really the one involved in politics, was jailed. And he remains jailed by Lukashenko. It's outrageous on every level. Lukashenko has arrested thousands. His thugs have beaten many people. And now, listen to this, now his Interior Ministry has announced they are prepared to use live ammunition on protesters. Again, they are prepared to shoot protesters, they say. Like I said, it's escalating. It's more dangerous. It's a threat to neighboring Russia. Where do we go from here? Listen to this backstory, share it please, and subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. All right, I want to introduce you to Edward Lucas, who, if you haven't read his stuff before, you've got to. He is a well-known journalist. I know him from his days at The Economist. He's written brilliant pieces about Eastern Europe and Putin and Russia, and he is now with CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis. Hi, Edward.
Hello, nice to be on the show.
Edward, let's talk about Belarus. On Monday, the ex-Soviet country's Interior Ministry threatened to fire on protesters, marking a major escalation. I mean, they're talking about using live ammunition on protesters.
That is an escalation, and the regime was lashing out over the weekend against the Women's March on Saturday, against the big demonstration on Sunday, and then again on Monday when it was pensioners marching. So we see both a sort of new brutal edge to their attempt to crack down, but also we saw the dictator, the autocrat, the leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, meeting some of the opposition leaders at KGB headquarters for what seemed to be at least the appearance of an olive branch.
It seemed like some bizarre photo op, because as he met with some people in prison, there were, still hundreds and hundreds of people being arrested the next day on the street. More than 700 people arrested on Sunday after his little photo op on Saturday. I mean, that it didn't seem very genuine.
I think it's certainly not genuine. The question is whether it's effective. And I think what Lukashenko and his cronies are trying to do is to split the opposition, to bog them down in talks on a new constitution or constitutional changes, and hope that the onset of winter and the fear of being beaten and arrested will gradually blunt the edge of the street protests. I think that's his best shot, and that's what he's trying to do.
All right, well, the opposition's just upped the ante. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has announced, and as you well know, she has been pushed out of Belarus. She is now in Lithuania, but speaking and getting more aggressive in her comments to the press in the European Union. She is now saying not only is she the winner of the August 9th election, but the ultimatum is October the 25th. If Lukashenko does not step down and call new elections, which, as you well know, he's not going to, they will shut the entire country down. They are calling everybody to the street.
That is a big roll of the dice, and I worry that they don't have the organizational depth that they need to make that happen. I covered Solidarity in Poland in the early 80s, and that was a really serious labor union where they had strike funds and networks of for communication and support and organization all over the country at every level. And the record of the Belarus opposition so far is not very encouraging when it comes to getting industrial workers out on strike. They've won the battle of ideas, they've won the battle of creativity, they are the dominant force on the streets when they choose to come out, but they are not the dominant force in heavy industry and in workplaces. And if they really mean to shut the country down, that means the big factories, it means the railways, it means the power grid, it means all these things. And I don't think at the moment that they've got the kind of reach and clout that you need to make that happen.
That's interesting because, she obviously is very popular there. And she is accusing the authorities now of state terror while her husband remains in prison. And she had a telephone conversation with him and to show that he is not cowed by remaining in custody all these months. He has told her she needs to be more aggressive, that the opposition needs to be more aggressive, and they need to really confront Lukashenko now.
Well, they're an amazing couple, and I think we all, as outsiders, need to celebrate and acknowledge, recognize the incredible courage and determination and creativity of the Belarus opposition there. It reminds me of the collapse of communism 30 years ago, the sort of extraordinary scenes we saw on the streets of the cities of Central and Eastern Europe in that long ago era. But the trouble with being abroad as an opposition leader is you do lose contact with what's happening back in the homeland. And I think that it's a gamble to say that they can bring the country out on strike. It's possible they're trying to bounce the regime into negotiations and they will then lift the strike threat. It's also possible the regime says, fine, bring it on. Anyone who goes on strike gets fired. Now what? And if the strike is not effective, that will be a big blow to the opposition's credibility and also to the personal credibility of Mrs. Tikhanovskaya.
Are you amazed at the tempo when you take a look at what's happening there every weekend on Sunday? These marches, 100,000, 200,000, not only in Minsk, but across the country. People blocking policemen, tying up traffic, even beating back some of these masked KGB people who pull up in vans and try and do snatch and grabs, and the crowd turns on them. It seems like it's getting more violent, and it seems like right now the opposition is not tiring.
It is getting more violent. It's also getting more political in the sense of it's not just about democracy, it's about regime change and increasingly saying to the Russians, keep your hands off Belarus. So the protests are evolving. I don't see the size that I would like to see. I think that if we saw 1 million people on the streets, that would spell the end of the regime. At the moment, it's lost its moral authority and it's lost the battle of ideas. But in the end, these regimes fall for 3 reasons. They crumble at the top. They split at the top. We don't see that happening. They crumble at the bottom. We don't see that happening. Or they're just overwhelmed by sheer force of numbers. We don't see that happening either. So for now, Lukashenko has retained the confidence of the Russians. They are not trying to undermine him, though they easily could. And his security forces, his goons, are still turning up to work every day. And I think that he has got a good chance of surviving probably until the spring. I think after that, it may well be that Putin has maneuvered someone else into position, and Putin will then try and have his own kind of regime change and put someone in power who's less toxic than Lukashenko, but still acceptable to the Kremlin.
Edward, spring is a pretty long horizon compared to some of the other predictions, but maybe some of them are hopeful as well that the regime could crumble before then. There is no sign, as you say, of crumbling right now. Is Putin making a mistake by continuing to back Lukashenko? He's worried these demonstrations could appear in Russia himself. But at the same time, generally, people in Belarus were pretty warm to Russia. Now, there is a sense from some of them, a feeling of betrayal.
I think that's right. Putin's got 2 problems. There's 2 things he doesn't want. One is democracy, but the other is anti-Russian sentiment. And the problem is the harder he pushes on one, the more he gets the other. So if he allows democracy to run riots, as he would see it in Belarus, and Lukashenko is toppled in a disorderly manner, that's a very bad example or good example for people who yearn for freedom inside Russia, a bad example for the regime, because people are going to say, well, we got rid of a dictator in Minsk, why can't we get rid of a dictator in Moscow? So that's one problem. The other problem is if he really backs Lukashenko and we have a Tiananmen Square style crackdown, then he transforms the pro-democracy movement into an anti-Russia movement, and he doesn't want that either. He saw what happened in Ukraine, where they intervened, and the result was to turn Russia's biggest and most important neighbor into a country where the Kremlin is a swear word. Now, he hasn't got that problem yet in Belarus, but he could get it. So he needs to play a very careful, long game, and I think that's what he's doing.
Last question. Is Europe and America playing a careful, long game? Are they being successful with taking out these sanctions? Most of the countries, not against Lukashenko himself, but against dozens of people around him, including the Interior Ministry, they don't want to appear to be too involved because that will involve Russia more, is their thinking. Is that smart? Is that strategic?
I would love to say it was smart and strategic. I think instead it's symbolic, slow and spineless. I think that the West has been very late to this party. It's true we don't want to give the Kremlin propagandists a gift and let them portray this as a pro-Western, anti-Russian demonstration, opposition movement, because that wouldn't be doing any favors. But we could do more. We could have put sanctions on the regime earlier. We could have put pressure on Russia earlier. We could have given support to the opposition earlier, and we haven't done any of that. The standout success here is Lithuania, and the Lithuanian Foreign Minister, Linas Linkevičius, is kind of standing in as leader of the free world, although he's the foreign minister of a country of 3 million people, because the European Union...
Lithuania has been very bold.
They've been very bold, and they are a next-door neighbor. They really get it. They share a common history with Belarus. They've got recent experience of dictatorship. And I take my hat off to the Lithuanians for their efforts. I just wish other countries were doing things too. But, Brussels is out to lunch, Washington's out to lunch, London's out to lunch, Berlin's out to lunch. We all have other things to worry about. And the Belarusian opposition is having to fight this with a very small but gallant bunch of allies. I wish we were doing more.
Edward Lucas, thank you so much. I would just say on a personal note, there are very few people who I enjoy reading their analysis and hearing as much as you. You're at the Center for European Policy Analysis now. I hope people follow you and read your material. And I really appreciate all of your time, Edward. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being on the show. Thank you for your questions.
Our next guest on Backstory with Dana Lewis is Andrei Sannikov. He's a former deputy foreign minister of Belarus, jailed, tortured by Lukashenko's regime, and still fighting not for his freedom, but for the freedom from dictator Alexander Lukashenko. It is a violent tug of war that is taking place in Belarus, and it continues, and there is a lot at stake. And Andrei, welcome.
Hello.
Andrei is a deputy foreign minister of Belarus until he resigned in protest in 1996. In 2010, he was a candidate in the presidential election. He was jailed by the KGB after protesting the election results. He was kept in prison 16 months and is now living in Warsaw. He was forced to flee the country. And, I want to stop there for a sec, Andrei, because when I was thinking about introducing you today, it's very easy because these things roll off our tongues as journalists. And sometimes we don't understand. But imagine if you're American or you're Canadian or you're British or you're living anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the world and you have been forced to flee your country. It is a startling thing for somebody like Andrei, who served in the government, was loyal to his country, believes in Belarus. And now you're living in Warsaw, Poland, and watching probably very emotionally what's going on in your own country right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, to say very emotionally, it's an understatement. You don't sleep at night. You are following the events. You are talking to friends. You are thinking about how to help, how else to help, and you are being, and you feel very frustrated that there is no real knowledge of the Belarusian situation in the world. Still, there is no knowledge, and there are no adequate measures taken by the democratic world towards against this dictator, ruthless dictator, and his thugs. Yeah, it is very difficult, very, as you said, emotional. But what keeps all of us going is the astonishing courage of the Belarusian people, the fascinating behavior, and the resoluteness with which they peacefully fight this murderous regime. Murderous because it started murdering people as early as the 90s, and not only the politicians. We know about the 4 cases in 1999 and 2000, but also, as Lukashenko confessed himself several times, they were shooting criminals without any trial, without any prosecution. I mean,
but they weren't criminals.
Yeah, they were criminals, but they were killed by Lukashenko bodyguards. It is, in the plain light, in the daylight, it's without any, without any, pretense of doing justice to the people. And we don't know whether all of them were criminals or not. We just hear the man who is a compulsive liar to tell about his glorious days in the 90s, that he allegedly saved people from the 32 criminal groups, only to organize the only criminal group on the territory of Belarus today, his own.
All right, let me stop you for a second and roll this back a little bit, and that is fall of the Soviet Union, and all of these countries declare independence. The Baltics, the Stans, and Belarus. Lukashenko wins in a democratic election. Everybody thinks, that Eastern Europe has become democratic. What happened after that first election?
Well, there are different histories behind Baltic states, for example, and Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, those countries that are in the European part of the former Soviet Union, and those countries who are in Asian part. There are absolutely different histories. Baltics were lucky to, so to say, in inverted commas, to be under the occupation for 40 years. We've been under the Soviet totalitarian regime for more than 70 years. And Lukashenko was not elected immediately. We had a parliamentary republic for the first 3 years, at least. And that was, I think, that saved us from many mistakes that were made around us. But then the leadership of Belarus at that time, I mean the cabinet of ministers, was really incompetent, and they were driving country into stagnation. And then this populist came, named Alexander Lukashenko, who, as any populist, said that I have recipes for everything. I will restart economy in a new way that will benefit everybody in Belarus.
And that was a democratic election. People voted for it.
And that was a democratic election, but one thing should be underlined, that this was election against, not for. I mean, the vote was against the stagnation of then Prime Minister Vyacheslav Kibic in favor of the populists. So it was clearly, because Lukashenko was little known, and he promised a lot, but he was not known for delivering anything. So people just believe he was a farm manager or something. Yeah, he was a farm manager before that. He served also in prison as the prison guard. He was doing on petty party positions, and so no, he was a very loudmouth populist, and in a way he ushered the era of populism in the world. Sometimes I think that now we have so many populists in the democratic world as well, that Lukashenko probably was the first one to indicate that this danger is coming to the world, not only to the former Soviet Union.
So why did you run against him? I mean, you ran against him in what year, and then what happened in that election?
Yes, I ran against him in 2010. Why? Because it was clear that the country was going into the abyss, because after several more or less economically successful years, because of Russian subsidies, the crisis of 2008, the financial crisis, really indicated that Lukashenko's economy will not cope with it it will collapse. And it was clear also that we had a dictatorship in Belarus. And we were talking all our friends and all our partners in the West, in the democratic world, that we have to deal with it, not only us in Belarus, but also in Europe and the United States and Canada, those who are interested in values, not in the strengthening of dictatorship in the world. So we did run against him. I say we because I had a very strong team. And we actually predicted that the election will be rigged. And we had a very strong support from the people, not as strong as the anti-Lukashenko movement has today. And yes, we were offering negotiations, speaking about negotiations that some in the West are still thinking that it will be a solution in Belarus. No, it will not be a solution. Negotiations with Lukashenko is out of the question today. So we were offering negotiations at that time, not only to the dictator himself, but mostly to the people in his government and to the official circles. But it was rejected, and we were thrown in jail because Lukashenko was so scared that he saw so many people in the square on the night of election, that at that time he ordered himself personally, and that was the signal. He ordered himself personally the brutal dispersal, brutal crackdown of the innocent, peaceful demonstration and innocent civilians. It was a signal that he will be ready, if pardoned, if this kind of crackdown is ignored, then we will have to really we have to expect something more brutal, which is happening today.
We made a mistake in the West because that was really the first fire when the West should have really leaned on Belarus and forced him to rehold that election or cancel that election. And in the end, he got away with it. And that now, fast forward to this summer, he's held this election by every single country's estimation, from America to Britain to all of the European Union now. He stole an election and it was falsified. So now, Andrei, they've taken out the sanctions against Belarus. What is that going to do? They've named some people in Belarus, and they've said that they are going to, freeze assets abroad, travel bans. Is that going to do anything?
It's very good that you say we made a mistake, but it's Dana Lewis says so. I don't hear anybody from present officials or former officials from European Union, from the Western world, from the democratic countries saying the same thing. I don't hear anybody recognizing the mistakes. I don't hear anybody taking responsibility for.
Forgive me for that, but this is coming from my years in Eastern Europe as a correspondent based in Moscow for 12 years. And I understand through a lot of the former Soviet countries that did not embrace democracy very well, where democracy was still born, that we probably should have tried to deal with Lukashenko in that year rather than this summer. Now we have to deal with him now, but it was allowed. People turned a blind eye.
Yeah, absolutely. And the world should have dealt with Lukashenko in 1999 when there were political murders in Belarus. That was the most horrible year for Belarusians until this year, because the opposition was destroyed, the leaders were murdered, and there was no reaction at that time. Everybody was keeping very quiet, yes, introducing some sanctions, condemning, making statements. But it continued. You will be astonished to find out that till this time, European Union was providing assistance to Lukashenko's police, for example. That in September 16, in the midst of all this crackdown of people being brutally beaten, killed, and even raped in prison, the Lukashenko police got surveillance drones from European Union worth of $850,000. these drones that can be used to identify people during the demonstrations. You know the cases when the Canadian company, for example, of course it is owned by Russian, German Guterres, but the Canadian company supplied the water cannons for Belarusian police, which have been used extensively now in Belarus. And there are many other examples like that. So there is...
in fairness to Canada, because I'm Canadian, so I mean, I think that I was shocked that those water cannons were ever sold to Lukashenko. But in fairness, Canada has now also taken out sanctions against, I believe, against Lukashenko himself. And they're one of the few countries to do it. The UK, in Canada, the European Union sanctions stopped short of actually sanctioning Lukashenko himself.
But to answer your question about the sanctions, I think that these personal sanctions, targeted sanctions, are nothing. Because if there was not a history of lifting the sanctions without any preconditions being met by the regime, then we could probably talk about their efficiency. Otherwise, the sanctions were introduced when I was in jail. They were lifted in 2016 to encourage Lukashenko to continue with his politics, to encourage Lukashenko to strengthen the regime, to encourage Lukashenko to strengthen the police force in Belarus.
All right. What do we do with them now? What do we do with about this now? Like this picture that we're showing now, these are men that are showing up in black masks on the weekends when these large demonstrations take place in the hundreds of thousands in Minsk and across the country. They snatch and grab people from the street. There's a lot of video online of them beating people in custody, attacking people who are even just walking on the street. I mean, these are not violent demonstrations. Most of them have been peaceful demonstrations. And the Oman uniformed police, but also these other guys show up in their masks, KGB. The numbers of detentions now, Andrei, are what, in the thousands? And what do we do about it?
The number of detentions is more than 14,000 already. The criminal cases are opened against about 400 people. The people in jail, the numbers are in thousands. And the last Sunday, there were 714 people detained and arrested. So it is horrible, really. Right. I always answer this question.
Sorry, when you say horrible, I don't think people in the West have watched everything that's going on, because I keep a pretty close eye on it. Here's a list, like elderly people being tear gassed on the weekend, because a lot of the demonstrations have been carried out by elderly people that are going peacefully to the street waving flags. Students being arrested in university, dragged out of university. Beatings where men and women are grabbed on the street, and you can hear in the video them beating them in the vans where they are arresting them. And incredibly, some of the crowd then turns on the police, and there are violent confrontations at times between the crowd, essentially beating these policemen and these masked KGB people back from grabbing people off the street and forcing them to let some of them go. I mean, it is very violent, and it is shocking to see this in Europe today.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and it is the question is if there is a political will in the West to deal with this situation, because it is dangerous not only for us as Belarusians but also for the world. It is dangerous. Clearly it's a security breach. Clearly it's a threat to the international security. And you're asking about the sanctions. Okay, you're now talking from England, where Great Britain was the third trade partner of Lukashenko's regime in oil products, the third one after Russia and Germany. So economic sanctions, trade sanctions, financial sanctions, and declaring this Oman riot police a criminal organization, terrorist organization internationally. And there is a petition now in the International Criminal Court from Belarusians to start investigating and to start criminal procedures against Lukashenko and his regime. So, these sanctions are not really sanctions. I mean, the one that are being discussed in the European Union, that are introduced by Canada, by Great Britain, by United States, they are travel bans. They are mild restrictions to travel to the part of the world to the real criminals.
Right. Well, if you don't think they're very muscular, what should we be doing? What should we be doing?
You have to take very strong measures, financial, and it is, morally justifiable, because all these strong measures should be tied to the release of political prisoners and the cessation of all kind of violence in the streets and in prisons.
Sir, and I don't mean to interrupt, but because you're raising such interesting points all the time, and I have to jump in. Why is this not, when you say it's criminal, why is this guy not headed for the Hague? Why is this not, at a certain point, does it become a war crime?
It is. In my view, it's a genocide that is going now. It could be compared with genocide and with war crime. But we are so weak with universal jurisdiction that some people have to work on it now. I mean lawyers, I mean real specialists or legal specialists, because that those who are occupying the positions, formerly occupying the position of rulers of the countries, they are not persecuted properly. So now in Europe, the European parliamentarians are talking about the 5th of November, that is the final end of Lukashenko's term. So let's start doing something after that. Let's talk about the Hague. Let's talk about the war crimes. Let's raise this issue in the United Nations, in everywhere. Let's take this issue in individual countries. British lawyers are known for their very skillful attitude towards such cases, such difficult cases. We need international expertise. We need really, I think Belarusian case is moving the democracy agenda forward, but only if the West...
You arrive at this argument in the West where people feel that the West should stay out of it, because if they get too involved in it, that will anger Putin in Russia, and that will bring the Russians into the conflict, and that it will escalate the conflict. What is your opinion?
It's not opinion. It's, Russia is already there. Russia is working not only on Belarusian state TV as propagandists, they're lying to the people, but Russian security forces are working with Lukashenko on all these crackdowns that are going on.
Because they're worried about it coming to Russia. They're worried about these same demonstrations like the ones that were being organized by the poisoned opposition member Alexei Navalny. They're worried about it starting in Russia as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. They are worrying about something, and the West doesn't worry about something in Belarus. Because why to be so shy saying that no, it will be taken as interference? I hear it for 20 years, for more than 20 years already. Russia is doing everything it wants in Belarus and plays Lukashenko together with Lukashenko against the West, and the West is still being very timid. The one very simple thing should be recognized. There is nobody more supportive of dictatorial, aggressive policies of Russia in Belarus than Lukashenko. No matter what, he is still the Kremlin's number one man in Belarus. So if you want to if you want to threaten your security, you continue to be soft on him. I think that it is not the question. Again, it is not the question about even about Belarusians. It's the question about the security in the region. It's the question about the impunity of the real thugs, of real criminals. I think Bill Browder is doing a lot with Magnitsky Act, but the Belarusian case demonstrates that more should be done.
Bill Browder, just for people who don't know who he is, was a businessman who was operating in Russia. Eventually his assets were seized, and his lawyer Magnitsky was jailed and died in prison. And since then, Browder has carried on a campaign worldwide to bring about the Magnitsky Act sanctions against members of Putin's inner circle. And he continues to campaign for them, and people have adopted them from Canada to America. And the EU is still, Britain has adopted them, and the EU is still, I think, wading through it, and they are taking parts of those sanctions against individuals. Andrei, are you concerned the Interior Ministry of Belarus has now come out and said that they will use live ammunition. I mean, this seems like it's about to escalate and can get very bloody in Belarus and go from bad to worse. They are prepared to use live ammunition against demonstrators?
Yes, of course I'm concerned. I'm very concerned for many years, not only now, because I know that they are capable of that. But what it really means today, that they want, by any means, they want to provoke violence in Belarus. Since Belarusian demonstrators and protesters are being so peaceful, so resolute to stay non-violent, that they are doing everything. They started with all kinds of claims that Poland and Lithuania are financing the bands of, the groups of violent groups in Belarus, and they blamed other countries also. But they really want to provoke violence. And Lukashenko himself, I think he confessed that he was getting ready to order the provocation against the headquarters of the opposition during the elections. And I think these people can be expected to do anything. That's why we need strong reaction, because the escalation of violence happens because Lukashenko was not on the list of even those mild sanctions. He reads signals of the West very clearly, much better than the West reads his signals.
Tommy, I want to just wrap this up, but I hope that, the idea that he wants to provoke violence and use live ammunition on crowds, I think we'll take this to a completely different level, and the foreign outrage, the outrage in the West, I think nobody will accept that, and I think if he's toying with the notion of using live ammunition on crowds, I think that will be the end of him. Hopefully it will be the end of him, but hopefully we don't get to that stage, Andrei.
I hope so, because we really need to think about how to resolve this crisis without Lukashenko being ruler of the country and without Lukashenko giving orders. Because today I think the West has all the leverage. For example, why are those Belarusian ambassadors that didn't switch sides are not kicked out of the countries? Why are they still allowed to function and to pretend that they represent country and the citizens? They do not represent Belarusians. They do not represent country. Lukashenko kicked out the ambassadors of Belarus. Why the West is tolerating those spies and the servants of the dictator? And there are many other things. Because when I hear the questions, what can we do? Sorry, but I do take it that we don't have political will to do much. So let's discuss it at least. I think it's the time for discussion. Of course, never over, but the discussion has to have some very practical results.
Andrei, the last question I want to ask you is: America has always been the superpower that has been able to wade into these situations, sometimes successfully, sometimes making the situation worse. One would expect that the President of the United States would be warning Belarus now against using live ammunition, against escalating the violence, demanding that he release political prisoners. But Donald Trump has been very silent, whether it's anything to do with Russia's sphere of influence, and people are extremely critical of him for not speaking out against potential bounties against U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, not speaking out against Putin's aggression in Syria and elsewhere. Are you in any way thinking that Joe Biden, if he is able to win the election in November, would be somebody that would be more helpful? And are you looking for a more sympathetic ear from America if Biden is in the White House?
I don't want to interfere into internal affairs of the United States. But we need America. We need American leadership, not only us in Belarus, but in the world, I think. We need real American leadership because even in the case of political prisoners in Belarus, when America took strong decisions like in 2010, in 2011 about the sanctions, about economic sanctions, and political prisoners were released. So we need America back in the world with the leadership role.
I think most people believe that there needs to be a strong America on the diplomatic front. But America also has to set some good examples about its own democracy right now. And right now, that's very challenged in November. Andrei Sannikov, thank you so much for your time. Andrei is the former deputy foreign minister of Belarus. He was jailed by Lukashenko. He was tortured by Lukashenko. He has fled the country, and he is now one of the most important voices for Belarus to speak out and bring us all a little bit of backstory education on what is taking place there. Andrei, this is really my last question. You often call Lukashenko on Twitter crazy Lukashenko. Do you believe he is doing crazy things, or do you believe that Lukashenko is crazy himself?
We had a very famous diagnosis of Lukashenko made in the 90s by a doctor who is living now in the United States, and he diagnosed him with mosaic psychopathy. And I think that the things that he's saying today and doing today, it is not the things that an adequate and sane person would do. That's why I call him what he is today. But we shall overcome, and I think that you will see Belarus as an asset for the world peace and human rights and democracy instead of this regime that is being threatening everybody around. So long live Belarus, живе Belarus.
Andrei Sannikov, my very best to you. Thank you so much. And I think more than anything, if you are watching what's happening in Belarus, I don't think anybody would not be moved at these scenes of peaceful demonstrators on the weekends, especially. Watch it and follow it as people there peacefully attempt to struggle for freedom, attempt to get a president who a lot of people think is mad, who is committing crimes, arresting and torturing and beating and wrongly jailing political opposition and almost anybody on the street that these black masked KGB thugs are coming into contact with. I don't think anybody wouldn't be moved by watching what's happening there. We wish the people of Belarus all the best. Thanks.
Thank you, dear.
And that's this backstory on Belarus. Watch this story. I'm worried for peaceful demonstrators in Belarus, as it seems ex-President Lukashenko wants to instigate a violent episode, as has happened so many times in different uprisings in Europe. It may not end well, and I hope I'm wrong about that. This podcast launched 6 months ago, by the way. It's been recommended as one of the best international news podcasts. And we're looking for a sponsor, not necessarily a paid sponsor, but I'd like to support an organization that needs help, such as veterans groups or international aid organizations. If you would like to be featured here, let me know. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening to Backstory, and I'll talk to you again soon.